Thank you. I'd like to welcome the committee members, Drs. Kenyatta from the University of Washington Computer Science Department, Dr. Revi from Atlas, Dr. Clayton Lewis from Computer Science, and Dr. Penelope Bennett from Hypotheses, Integrated Physiology. The way this will work is Heather will talk for about 45 or 50 minutes. If you have clarifying questions, feel free to ask them, and let's try not to wander off into the ozone during her talk. Except for the committee, they're free to wander at any time. At the end of her talk, we will welcome questions from anyone in the audience. At some point, we'll ask the audience, save the committee members to excuse us, and then the committee will remain and ask questions of Heather. And then she will leave, and so if there are people out there to, comfort her while the committee's well, she knows because when this happened to me, my committee finished off 2 bottles of champagne while I was waiting outside wondering what was going on. Anyway. Sounds good. I would also like to welcome Dr. Meg Ambrose from Georgetown University and Dr. John Onmich from Kenyatta National Hospital in Nairobi. Welcome. Okay, Heather, you're on.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming to attend the defense today. Again, my name is Heather Underwood, and the title of my dissertation work is The PartoPen, Using Digital Pen Technology to Improve Labor Monitoring in the Developing World. A high-level overview of the PartoPen project is that it is a new approach to addressing some of the challenges associated with maternal labor monitoring in the developing world. It uses digital pen hardware and software to enhance rather than replace the Partograph, which is a paper-based labor monitoring tool. And this work overall is an effort to better understand the relationship between Partograph completion, the quality of care, and clinical outcomes in the developing world setting. The contributions of this dissertation include the PartoPen hardware and software itself, a Partograph evaluation rubric that was created during the data analysis phase, successive refinement of the PartoPen design and implementation based on 4 studies that I completed in Kenya. Some reflections on the PartoPen project, including some high-level reflections and also some of the research challenges that I faced. And then finally, like I said, an improved understanding between the relationships of Partograph completion, quality of care, and clinical outcomes. The way that I've structured this presentation, I'm going to highlight the problem in motivation, which is around maternal mortality rates in the developing world. I'll also touch on some related work there. And then I'll go into the PartoPen design and implementation, which talks about the technology that I used and how I wrote the software. Then I'll talk about the research questions and the studies that I conducted in Kenya, talk about some of the reflections and research challenges, future work, and then conclusions. So first, the problem and really the motivation for this whole project is maternal mortality rates worldwide. In particular, in 2010, the World Health Organization estimated that about 300,000 women died because of childbearing-related complications. And almost all of these deaths occurred in low-resource settings, and most of them could have been prevented, which is the key piece here. And these statistics come about 10 years after the initiation of the Millennium Development Goals. Particularly Millennium Development Goal 5 is to reduce maternal mortality by 3/4 by the year 2015. And while many countries are on track to meet this particular goal, a lot of sub-Saharan African countries are not. In Kenya in particular, maternal mortality rates remain high at 488 per 100,000 live births. This is in contrast to the US, which is 21, and in Sweden, which is 4. So we've still got a long way to go. The main causes of maternal mortality on a global scale include postpartum hemorrhage, indirect causes, which are things like HIV, which compromise a woman's immune system during pregnancy and childbirth, and also sepsis and infection. However, obstructed labor, which represents this 8% chunk of the graph, is often underreported because it's a precursor to many of these conditions, such as postpartum hemorrhage and sepsis. So that slice is only what was reported as a death due to obstructed labor, but not necessarily all the cases of obstructed labor. Just to note, obstructed labor is also the primary cause of obstetric fistula, which is a very severe maternal morbidity that affects many people, many women in the developing world. And there are not many cases in the developed world because of the readily available cesarean sections and emergency care that we have here. The Partograph is a paper form that was designed to help detect cases of obstructed labor early enough to get women to the hospitals and facilities where they could receive this emergency care. It was developed by Philpott in 1972, and a number of tests were done in Zimbabwe to determine the effectiveness of this tool. And what they found was a decrease in the number of augmented labors and of obstructed labor cases.
Question. Augmented
Yes.
labor is induction?
Augmented labor is induction, yes.
Clarification?
Go for it.
Augmentation is not induction, it's the use of Pitocin. Induction is starting labor with Pitocin.
She's our resident baby deliverer over here, so she knows it all. All right, so the Partograph was shown yes, okay, so augmentation, now I know that that's good. So when used correctly, the Partograph was shown to reduce the number of obstructed labor cases, and this was done in a number of studies. And this summarizes the studies that have looked at Partograph completion and outcomes. The important thing to know about this is that, or to recognize, is that most of them fall in the lowered and improved categories. So most of the studies that have been done look at how Partograph completion positively affects maternal outcomes. One in particular study was the one done by the World Health Organization in 1990, and the results were published in 94. And this study was the largest scale study that's ever been done on Partograph outcomes, Partograph completion and clinical outcomes. And this was done with 35,000 women in Southeast Asia, and this study also showed a significant decrease in the number of augmented labors and also obstructed labor cases. Despite these proven benefits, or these shown benefits through all of these studies, there exists a number of barriers to proper use, or to use at all, of the Partograph. And several studies in Kenya have recently shown that these are the primary barriers to correctly using the Partograph. The ones outlined in green are the ones that the PartoPen project attempts to address, and the ones in red, such as staff shortages, retroactive completion, a lack of positive role models, and attitude among the nurses, were not addressed by the PartoPen. But to address these barriers as a whole, the Partograph has seen a number of evolutions. So on the left, you see Philpott's original Partograph, which is from 1972. And on the right, you see the World Health Organization Partograph that was used in the study in 1990. To try and reduce form complexity, the WHO released another version of the Partograph in 2000 that eliminated the latent phase and only looked at the women who were in active labor and began monitoring them then. They also released a color-coded version of this Partograph in order to help clearly identify where normal labor, abnormal labor, and potentially obstructed labor fall on the graph. There have also been a number of other alternatives to the Partograph that attempt to capture the same information. So this rounded Partograph simply looks at cervical dilation versus time. The pink one is just an equation. You basically use the time of admission and her current dilation to calculate when she's expected to deliver. And then you hope that happens then, and if not, then you adjust it accordingly. There's also been a number of technological Partograph solutions. One that I want to point out is the World Health Organization e-learning tool, which is actually focused on teaching and training the Partograph, not on digital use of the Partograph in clinics. So this project builds on a number of areas of related work, which I explain in much more detail in the dissertation. But for the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to highlight information and communication technology solutions that attempt to bridge the paper-digital divide, some of the ICTs for health applications, and also some of the specific digital pen applications that have been used in health. So ICTs and paper. So due to the continued reliance on paper in a number of sectors, education and health and finance, a lot of digital solutions have been focused on trying to bridge that gap while retaining the unique affordances of paper while providing that digital advantage. So a lot of these are tablet-based because you retain the handwriting motion, but you get the digital advantage. One of the drawbacks of this, though, is that it doesn't actually produce a paper copy, and it often is a significant departure from the current system that's in place. Some of the smartphone applications that have been developed attempt to capture paper forms using the camera phone and then digitize the data that way. But a lot of usability problems have been found with the small screen size, capturing it correctly within the frame, and having the user hold it still enough to get a quality photo. Some of the other devices, down in the bottom right-hand corner, is the digital slate device. And this was used for a project out of Microsoft Research India for microfinance applications. And the device itself is fairly costly, but the other piece is that it doesn't differentiate between individual pieces of paper. So this is something that the PartoPen does do and can provide patient-specific and per-paper information. So now looking at some of the ICT solutions for healthcare, and a lot of these focus on mobile phones as the platform. And this is largely because they've become such a ubiquitous platform worldwide. So they're widely accessible and relatively easy to program for. So most of these mobile phone applications have focused on data collection, point of care support for community health workers, and also health promotion and education tools, not only for healthcare workers, but also for patients themselves. Like I said, one of the benefits of mobile phones is that they're a very accessible and widely used platform. However, some of the drawbacks, and one particularly I want to point out, is this idea of duplicate work. So oftentimes what happens when a mobile phone solution is introduced into a traditionally paper-based system is that the paper record is still required, and so the nurses or midwives end up filling it out on the paper and then also having to put it into the secondary platform that they've been asked to use. So this duplicate work has been a really big problem. Which brings us to digital pens in healthcare. Digital pens are a way to reduce that duplicate work by capturing and digitizing your handwritten notes as you write them. Most of the studies that have been done in the healthcare context with digital pens have been in the developed world, and then also have focused on the usability of the device itself and the accuracy of the data that the pen is able to capture, as opposed to using the pen as a clinical decision support system, like the PartoPen. Which brings us to the PartoPen. So the PartoPen uses LiveScribe digital pen technology. LiveScribe is a company out of Oakland, California that sells digital pens. And the unique piece about LiveScribe's technology is that it offers audio input and output. And the studies that I mentioned before that were focused on digital pens in healthcare, they weren't able to do anything with audio input-output or clinical decision support. So LiveScribe technology offers us this unique opportunity to provide real-time decision support as someone is interacting with the form. The pens interact with the form by recognizing a dot pattern that's printed on the paper. So an infrared camera in the tip of the pen is triggered when you touch the pen to the surface, and it takes 70 to 100 images per second of these 6x6 grids of dots. Each dot is offset on this invisible grid in one of 4 positions, which, for those of you who are familiar with binary, gives you 4 different x and y coordinates. And then the pen uses these as GPS, basically, to tell where on the paper it actually is, which allows you to program some interesting functionality. So the LiveScribe SDK is Eclipse-based, and it offers this tool called the Paper Designer. And the Paper Designer allows you to import an image, which in this case is an image of the Partograph, and then specify the regions on the Partograph where you want the pen to have meaningful interactivity with it. So once you do this, you develop your penlet, and this is all written in Java, and you define how the pen should interact in each one of those areas. Then you compile your Java file into a jar file, upload that to the Smart Pen, upload the paper product that you've developed to the Smart Pen, and print out your dot paper. And then the pen recognizes and knows how to interact with that piece of paper. So the PartoPen penlet provides 3 pieces of functionality: use instructions, decision support, and reminders. And I'll go into those more in a minute. The basic code path that the penlet follows when you touch the pen to the Partograph for the first time is that it kicks off 3 different actions. And the first is recognition of the unique page ID. I realize this is a little challenging to read, but each, and this is something I mentioned before when I was talking about the digital slate, the dot pattern on each form is unique. So the pen can recognize the difference between one partograph and another, even when they look exactly the same, because the dot pattern on them is different. So it kicks that off, and it determines whether or not it's already started taking measurements for this particular patient or not, or if this is a brand new patient. It also recognizes the penlet-defined region ID, and this is really to help this allows the pen to know what piece of the form it's pressing on. So if it's pressing on an instruction button, it will produce the right instruction, and if it's pressing on a decision support area, it'll produce that functionality. And then finally, it triggers the handwriting recognition engine and starts that going as well. And there's a lot more information, both in the dissertation and in my paper that was published at ACM Dev this year on the architecture and underlying software of the system. So I want to go over the 3 pieces of functionality in a little more detail. So use instructions were designed to encapsulate the entire World Health Organization user manual on Partograph use into short, very accessible audio prompts. So if a nurse midwife or a student, a nursing student, needs a reminder on how to use the cervical dilation part of the form, they can simply tap the pen onto the instruction button along the side and receive an audio prompt verbatim from the World Health Organization on how to use that part of the form. Second is decision support. Now, there's already decision support built into the Partograph in the forms of the alert and action lines. These were added by Philpott back in 1972, and this is really what helps guide birth attendants and nurses to know when a labor is progressing abnormally and to transfer a woman if she needs to be transferred to another facility. So the decision support that the PartoPen provides just enhances this. So if a nurse or a nursing student were to make a mark in the normal labor area, which is outlined in blue, nothing would happen because no action is necessary except to continue monitoring the patient. However, if there was a mark made within that green area, it's signaling that this patient needs increased monitoring because she's starting to look like she might be progressing abnormally. And then if her cervical dilation next measurement crosses over into the orange, you know that this is probably a case of obstructed labor or at least prolonged labor, and you need to start providing this patient with more care. There's also decision support built into the fetal heart rate part of the graph. So if a fetal heart rate is too high or too low, the pen will provide you with scrolling text along the OLED screen and sort of a ringtone to get your attention that that measurement is indicative of something going not quite the way it should. There's also time-based reminders built into the pen. And the way that the reminders work is that when a birth attendant plots a fetal heart rate measurement or a cervical dilation measurement, a timer is kicked off. For fetal heart rate, it's half hour. For cervical dilation, it's every 4 hours. And once this timer is kicked off, the nurse will receive those reminders for the specific patients every half hour and every 4 hours. And the way that it knows which patient the reminder is for is actually down here in the bottom of the form, where there's these PartoPen reminder IDs. And these are designed for things like a patient's initials or their room number, which I found a lot of nurses liked to do at Kenyatta. And so that short code, either the initials or the room number, will show up on the screen along with the half-hour or 4-hour reminder. So as you can see, we also made some significant changes to the form. All of the data is the same, but this is Kenyatta's old form that they were using before the PartoPen project, and this is the new form. This one's been photocopied about 500 times. And so it's slanted and kind of blurred out. And this was also one of the reasons I had a very tough time finding a digital copy to work with. And so here you can see on the PartoPen form that it actually is much straighter and neater. And there's also a couple things that I've added to the form. Like I said, the PartoPen reminder IDs, boxes at the bottom, the audio controls off to the right. And then that blue box at the top was actually something that was added later as a suggestion from one of the nurses. Because what would happen is a patient would deliver, but there would be all these reminders stored up on the pen for that patient. So they would get reminders for patients who had already delivered. So by signing in that blue box, they were able to cancel the reminders for that patient after they've delivered. So in order to test how the PartoPen functionality affected Partograph completion, conducted a number of studies in Kenya. The first one was a user evaluation to answer this particular research question, which is, are nurses able and willing to even use the system? So this work was published in the IEEE Global Humanitarian Technology Conference in 2012. And what this study actually looked at was the current perceptions of Partograph use among nurses, and then also introducing them to a prototype of the PartoPen and getting usability and design feedback on that. So these are a couple of quotes from the nurses. Their perceptions of Partograph use are very positive. They like the Partograph, they want to keep using it, and they see it as a very valuable tool. In terms of PartoPen usability and design feedback, they thought it was a pretty useful tool. It alerted me that I had to take an action. The patient was going into distress. It is good for reminding, even though I already know what to do. And that's underlined because the nurses at Kenyatta are very well trained, and they do know what to do in those situations. One of the things I did want to mention, some of the design feedback I got was really useful for refining the design of the PartoPen, particularly in terms of the audio prompts. The way that it worked before I got the feedback was that you would create measurements, and no matter how many times you tap there, it would just start the audio over every time. So it was adjusted so that nurses weren't actually desensitized to that audio the more they heard it, and that they could just access the prompt once regardless of how many times they touched. So the second research question was explored through two studies, one at the University of Nairobi with nursing students, and the other at Kenyatta National Hospital with nurse midwives. So the first study was with nursing students, like I said, at the University of Nairobi. And the way that this study was set up is that the students were split into three groups. The first group received a silent PartoPen, so none of the functionality was present. Then the second group received a PartoPen, but absolutely no training on how to access or use any of the PartoPen functionality. And then the third group was given a completely functional PartoPen, but also got a 10 to 15 minute demonstration from us. And these little green boxes represent the possible case studies that each student got. So there were three possible case studies: a normal labor, a prolonged labor, and a prolonged labor that results in a cesarean section. And the students got 2 of 3 of those cases. So what we found when we were evaluating the Partographs, and this was based on how the Partographs compared to our answer keys, how the Partograph should have been filled out for each particular patient. And what we found was that group 1 scored 58% on average over both case studies that they received, whereas group 2 scored 63, can't read my own slides, and group 3 scored a 66% on average. So there was improvement among the groups. Then what I ended up doing was looking at the individual case studies. Mrs. C, the prolonged labor that ends in a cesarean section, has the most number of measurements that need to be made and is also the most complicated in terms of the decisions that need to be made for that particular patient. So when you look at the data by case study, you end up seeing a statistically significant difference between groups 1 with the silent PartoPen and group 3 with the PartoPen and training on Partograph completion for Mrs. C. So, circle. I circled it. That's what I did. All right. So after the students completed the worksheet, I also asked them to participate in a 20 to 30 minute focus group session. And this focus group session really focused on what they find challenging, how Partographs are taught in the classroom now, and what they find most difficult about it. And what came out of that focus group was that descent of the fetal head measurements and contraction measurements are the most difficult to plot. And this is because more than one thing is being plotted for the same measurement on the same graph. This makes it pretty challenging. So then I looked at the data by case study and also just for contraction completion and just for descent of the fetal head completion. And what we see again is that for the most complicated case study, Mrs. C, there was a statistically significant improvement between groups 1 and 3 for both contractions And actually, for descent of the fetal head, we saw statistically significant improvements for both groups 2 and 3. And the piece I want to point out here is that the group 2 got no training from us on how to actually use the PartoPen. And so this is pretty encouraging, because you can pick up a PartoPen and not know how to use it and still get a lot of benefit out of using it. So the third study was a maternity ward study at Kenyatta National Hospital. And these were the same nurses that participated in the user evaluation in March of 2012. And the nursing student study was done in June, and this one was done in July and August of 2012. The way this study was conducted was as a pre and post study. And we took 397 records from June and compared them to 352 records from August. And August was when the PartoPen project was implemented and being used by the nurses for every shift on a regular basis. The further classification of these records was that some of these 397 records actually had blank partographs or no partograph, or oftentimes they just said second stage across the entire partograph. What that is indicating is that the woman came in and she was not in labor anymore, she was delivering. And so there was really no labor to monitor there. So, and we did that for August as well. And then this last blue box shows how many partographs were actually completed fully with the PartoPen during August. And this number is much smaller than the 191 partographs because there's a lot of students that are present on medical rotations in the labor ward. And the students were filling out the majority of the partographs, but they weren't given PartoPens to use, only the nurses. So that's that. And I want to touch briefly on how we did the partograph grading and evaluation, which some people are more familiar with than they'd like to be, I imagine. But this is the way that Kenyatta does internal evaluation of their partograph completion rates. And this is a very binary form. They would go down for each section, fetal heart rate, cervical dilation, say correct, incorrect, complete, incomplete. And this is a very subjective way to grade these partographs because you don't really capture if that partograph was useful or used well, etc. So what we did was actually try and break it down even farther and capture more of that information. So this spreadsheet is overwhelming. I don't expect you to read the whole thing. The important piece is that there are 3 things that we were looking for each partograph section. So for fetal heart rate, not only were we looking if all the marks were present, we were also looking for if they were all the correct symbol and if they were spaced the correct amount of time apart. And one other thing I will say is that this correlates well with the instructions that were given from the PartoPen, because the PartoPen provides you with how to fill it out, what symbol to use, and how often to take the measurements. So the results of the maternity ward study were this. So first what we did was we broke it down into spontaneous vaginal deliveries, which is SVD, cesarean sections, which is CS, intrauterine fetal deaths, IUFDs, and then we looked at all of them together. And what you can see here is that June and August really didn't differ much in terms of partograph completion rates. When we looked at just the summary section, which is the part at the bottom that is a summary of the labor, we found that for cesarean section rates, there was a very statistical significant difference between the completion in June and August. However, this is likely due to the changes in the form, because the summary section was much easier to fill out on the PartoPen form. It was not necessarily because the pen helped them fill it out better. So this graph shows how many of the partographs for each category actually cross the action line. And this is important because that action line is where decisions should be made. And most oftentimes, the decision here is the cesarean section for women who have crossed that action line. So what you see is that in June, the rates of spontaneous vaginal deliveries that crossed the action line was actually higher. And this is indicating that a lot of the women who delivered spontaneously actually crossed that action line and should have received, potentially should have received a C-section. And then you see the flip for C-sections, which is a good thing as well, if you think about it that way. Okay, and so this is looking at August, pulling out just the pens from, just the Partographs from August that were filled out with the PartoPens, and then comparing that to the rest of August and all of June. And what you can see here is that the August Partographs that were completed with the PartoPens didn't have any in the 0 to 25% completion range, and also had the highest percentage of 75 to 100% completion. So at the completion of the maternity ward study in August of 2012, there was 20 pens that were donated to Kenyatta National Hospital, as well as a printer, because by the time I left, the system was very self-sustaining. The nurses were using the PartoPens and exchanging them between shifts on their own, and the records office was printing forms and providing them to the labor ward without any intervention from me. So we left the 20 pens and did a follow-up study in June of this year to see 3 things. The first, we wanted to collect some qualitative feedback from nurses on their perceptions of the PartoPen and how it has affected life in the labor ward. The second goal was to conduct a computer survey, and this was really to focus on that third contribution, which is the improved understanding of the clinical outcomes and quality of care. And then finally, to look at the robustness of the pens themselves. How well did they hold up after 9 months of use in the hospital setting? So this is the paper survey. It was 2 pages, and it took nurses anywhere between 15 and 30 minutes to complete. And a lot of the questions were free-form, just asking nurses to talk about their experience with the pens and also their perceptions of how it has helped or hindered or changed the way that the labor ward works. Some of the feedback that I got was pretty interesting. So a lot of the nurses expressed an increased pride in their jobs. And this is actually something that I saw towards the end of my time there in 2012. Only the nurses in the labor ward were part of this study, and Kenyatta National Hospital is a full-fledged hospital. So there were nurses and doctors coming to the labor ward to check out the pens and have the nurses show them how to use them. And the nurses just kind of got really built up by this, and they felt really proud of their jobs. Some of the other positive changes that were noted in the labor ward, a lot of the nurses touched on the reminder functionality, which is great because that was actually working and alerting them that patients needed measurements. And then also improved and quicker decision making. So that's kind of what we saw in that last graph. And then easier chart interpretation. So all good. Then the computer survey that I conducted was really targeted at these last research questions. Trying to get that understanding of the relationship between Partograph completion and clinical outcome. And then also looking at nurses' perceptions of how Partograph completion relates to Partograph usefulness. This is a screenshot of the survey that I developed. This is, again, written in Java. It's just a desktop application. And on the left, you see an anonymized Partograph taken from the sample of Partographs that were collected during the August maternity ward studies. And then on the right, you see a bunch of survey questions, asking the nurses what sections are properly filled out, which sections would you need to be filled out to feel comfortable making patient care decisions, et cetera. And so what we saw on the survey, so this top column of this table is actually the scores that we got for each of these Partographs based on the Partograph grading rubric we used to analyze the data. The second row there is the number of completes. So yes, this is a complete Partograph that the nurses actually gave. And only 2 nurses gave, out of 7 nurses took the survey. Only 2 nurses gave any Partograph a yes, this is complete, and they were both for the same one. And then this usefulness score is really interesting. So this is the average usefulness score that nurses gave each of these Partographs. And what you see, there's 2 things. The first one is that it correlates linearly with our composite scores. So this is a really good validation of that rubric that we developed. And then what you also see is that 4 of the 5 Partographs were deemed very useful, even though none of them gave them a complete. So the last piece of the study was to talk about, to look at how the pens held up after 9 months of use in the hospital. And so the pens that were left at Kenyatta, 19 out of 20 of them were fully functional when I returned. They were still in circulation, still in use. It was great. And then we decided to test these under simulated harsh conditions. These are things like dipping it in fake blood, dipping it in hydrogen peroxide, alcohol, all of these things. And what we found was that the pens were surprisingly robust even under these severe and pretty harsh conditions. 5 of the test conditions actually retained full functionality, which is pretty impressive. But the thing I want to point out is that all of the pens, under all of the severe and simulated harsh conditions, retained the ability to write on paper. So even in complete system failure, you're still able to take your measurements on the piece of paper. So summarizing the results of these studies, we saw that nurses were willing and able to use the system. The PartoPen improved Partograph completion rates among the nursing students, but not necessarily in the maternity ward study, but that was due to a lot of confounding factors, which I'll touch on in just a minute. And then the relationship between Partograph completion, quality of care, and clinical outcome is not linear. And so what I'm trying to say here is that just because you complete a Partograph, or just because you don't complete a Partograph, doesn't mean you didn't provide quality care. And just because you provide quality care doesn't necessarily mean clinical outcome was good. And this is especially true at a referral hospital like Kenyatta that sees a lot of very severe cases at their hospital. And then finally, the nurse's perceptions of Partograph usefulness does not necessitate a fully complete Partograph. So even incomplete Partographs are very useful to nurses. And what we saw is that there are sort of brackets for our composite scores that correlate to useful Partographs. So this helped us refine the grading rubric that we used. So now I want to talk a little bit about the reflections and research challenges. First, this mismatch in study design and study site. So what I mean by that is Kenyatta National Hospital is one of the biggest, most well-trained hospitals in Kenya. So the nurses, they know the difference between complete and incomplete Partographs, and they know how to use the tool. And the PartoPen functionality was designed to address training barriers, whereas at Kenyatta, the staff shortages were a much bigger barrier. So any benefits that the PartoPen was providing in terms of training was overshadowed potentially by these staff shortage issues that we were seeing. Additionally, the PartoPen study was actually intended to be conducted at 2 sites, Kenyatta National Hospital and Pumwani Maternity Hospital, which is the largest maternity-only hospital in Kenya. And this is Pumwani's filing system. These are trash bags full of patient records. So to do the pre and post study that we did at Kenyatta, we would have had to go through hundreds of trash bags to find all of the files from June, because these aren't organized into the June bag and the August bag. So there was a mismatch there that prevented us from doing the study there. Some of the high-level reflections on this project were actually published in a graduate student guidebook on HCI research in healthcare. And some of the things I touched on were time management, and this really focuses on all the administrative processes that are involved in healthcare and doing research in healthcare that take much longer than you think they will. So budget more time. Doing more than the research requires. This one I found to be particularly useful in gaining the trust and acceptance of the nurses just by helping out and being useful in the labor ward every day, whether that was helping them file papers or holding someone's hand while they were going through labor because there were no nurses around. It was just being helpful. And that also gives you this really tangible thing to take away as a researcher every day, even if your research is, sort of abstract. And then finally, a lesson in humility. This could be the alternate title of this dissertation. But you learn to be very humble about your work, and I found out very early on that it was detrimental to both the study participants and to the research to be too emotionally invested in the product that you've created, and not allowing flexibility for design changes and feedback and scrapping the whole thing if it doesn't actually work. So this is a list of the publications and presentations that I've given over the last 3 years. One I'd particularly like to point out is when Kenyan National Television came to the labor ward in August and had my claim to fame on Kenyan news, which was pretty fun. So future work. So a lot of the things that kept coming up in interviews was about patients not being referred in time to Kenyatta to actually receive quality care. And one of the big issues here was that the data that had or hadn't been collected at the primary care facilities wasn't actually being transferred to the referral hospitals. So So once the patients actually got there, they'd have to do the whole exam again to figure out what was going on. So the digital pen potentially could provide a nice link between transferring data from one hospital to another. Also, the nurse accountability and detection of retroactive completion, these could be accomplished using the timestamps in the pen. So because the pen does capture a digital record of the things that you're writing and the measurements that you're taking, you can tie these to interesting things and actually detect how many times the Partograph is being completed after a patient's already delivered. And this could give us some really interesting data on how useful the Partograph is actually being, because it's designed to be a real-time decision-making tool. Integration with electronic medical records. This is a big deal not only in developing countries who are slowly moving that way, but also here in the US. And then broadening nurse training and curriculum. And this largely stems from the success of the nursing student study. There's a lot of opportunities to expand the use of these pens to other forms, tests, et cetera, for students. Oh, and the Fab Lab, which is associated with the University of Nairobi, has recently reached out to me, and they want to teach a class on how to program digital pens, which would create an interesting sustainability pipeline there in Kenya for people who know how to program them, and then also to get the pens into the country. So a recap of the contributions. I won't say them all again. And then the high-level conclusions here. Partograph accuracy and completion does not necessarily imply better clinical outcomes or higher levels of nurse training. The PartoPen addresses training barriers, not necessarily staff shortages. So this is why we saw some of the results that we did. And then LiveScribe digital pens are surprisingly robust and robust enough for general hospital use. However, one caveat I would like to make here is that the printing system was not nearly as successful as the pens. So this was, the PartoPen is an entire system, not just the PartoPens. And so the printing, which I go into in great detail in the dissertation, had some interesting challenges, which we eventually overcame as well. So, and then I'd just like to close with this quote from Dr. Correa. He and I became close friends. He's a nurse midwife in the labor ward. He says, generally this goes a long way toward helping our mothers who are in labor so we can beat MGG5, reducing maternal mortality, which we want to reduce by 2015. And I think it is being realized by this PartoPen. So with that, I'd like to thank my committee, my parents for coming from Seattle, and my amazing research assistants, Sarah and Addie and Maya. So thank you very much.
Let's have questions from the broader audience.
Megan.
So did the nurses actually then use the pens like across shifts to like talk to each other then, like to like leave a certain note and be like, so make sure that you check like, as a form of communication?
So what we ended up doing, the nurses already had sort of a system in place for transferring patients. So what we had them do was just incorporate the transferring of the pen from one shift to another to the same nurse who was taking over their patients. So then they would start getting the reminders for patients that the other nurse had already set. The pens don't talk directly to each other. However, LiveScribe has come out with a Wi-Fi pen, and actually I just found out yesterday they just released a Bluetooth pen, the LiveScribe 3. So there's some interesting connectivity options there for transferring the data. Yeah.
Has anyone attempted to develop something like this for critical care medicine, septic patients, that kind of patient in the hospital?
Do you mean the clinical decision support piece where it's giving you real time?
Yes.
Not that I know of. Most of the digital pen studies that I've looked at are really focusing on data collection and data digitization and not using the audio for clinical use. But great idea. Yeah?
So what's next?
Oh, the what's next question. Well, right now, I started a Master's of Public Health this fall. After, because I'm bored and, don't have enough on my plate. No, doing the work in Kenya and just being in the hospital setting and seeing some of the interesting health issues, public health issues that were coming up in the labor ward really just inspired me to want to learn more about that and to get that underlying knowledge. And so that's what's next in the immediate future, to be determined in terms of after that. So. Oh, eye scratch. Megan.
So is LiveScribe interested in like developing more applications like this?
So LiveScribe has been very supportive. So when I started this project, they had a full-fledged third-party development program with SDKs and APIs and all of these things. And then they shut that down about 6 months into the project, much to my freak out. And they were focusing on more of this cloud-based stuff and moving towards other goals business-wise. But they have been very supportive and very helpful in giving me the resources that I need to pursue this project. In terms of whether they themselves will pursue projects like this, I'm guessing no. There's not much of a market here in terms of, at least for the PartoPen specifically. The developing country thing is sort of a problem. It doesn't really provide a good business case for them. But they are very excited to try and get more third-party developers in there to develop apps on their own, and they seem to be very supportive in terms of resources and stuff. So.
Other questions? This is remarkable timidity from a group.
Yeah, come on, guys. This is my favorite part. Yeah.
So, what, if you could imagine other researchers reading your work and moving it forward, where would you hope this moves forward to? What directions do you see this being used in the broader community?
The PartoPen specifically, or digital pens, or anything?
Take it either way.
So I think if someone was reading the work, what I would want them to take away from it is some of the higher level conclusions about thinking about the environment and how to design for that kind of environment and being flexible and all those things. It would be great if someone wanted to take this project and turn it into something more full-fledged in terms of developing it for other forms, developing a full suite of healthcare applications around the digital pen and paper-based systems. There's just so much you can do with it that's outside the scope of the Ph.D. And I am open to any and all offers of people who would like to work on that kind of stuff, because I think that it would be a really interesting challenge. And I think that as digital pens continue to evolve, there's going to be a lot of interesting opportunities there. But right now, they're still evolving, and so I'm not quite sure if they're at their prime yet for being the device of choice. Yeah.
So as a follow-up to some of the questions around sustainability, in terms of Kenyatta National Hospital, where do they kind of go from here? They have their pens, they have their PartoPens, but are they continuing with this? Is it something that other hospitals are looking at? What's sort of happening in the Kenyan landscape?
Yep, so they're sort of in a tumultuous time. Kenyatta specifically is still using the pens. They're still printing the forms and keeping the pens in circulation. They've drawn a lot of attention from other hospitals, but if anything that I found is that each hospital has very unique sets of challenges to design sort of the software system for. Right now, so Kenya just had their elections in March, and a new government came in, and one of the things that they implemented was free maternity care for all, without increasing the number of staff, or increasing the number of training, or increasing the pay for the nurses. So basically what happened at Kenyatta was there was this huge influx of patients, not critical care patients, patients wanting to receive the best quality care. And so Kenyatta is actually quite overwhelmed right now, and I don't think they're thinking too much about the PartoPen specifically. There's been a number of strikes recently trying to get higher wages and more staff. And so again, it really just underscores those complications and barriers that we saw of staff shortages, resource shortages, et cetera. So, however, I will say that we did look at some rural facilities, and we did look at Pumwani, and there's definitely the opportunity to implement those there, and they would have a lot of benefit based on what we've seen and kind of some new ideas I have for implementing them in those settings. But it would have to be designed specifically for them, and not just take the study design from Kenyatta and drop it in. So, yeah.
I'll follow up on that. The infrastructure to support this pen, the printing the paper, keeping the printers working, the batteries, the chargers, the people that know how to run all this system, and the whole infrastructure seems to be one of the major hurdles, having followed what you've been doing here.
Thanks, Dad. Yes, he has followed it very in detail. So yes, it is more than just the pens. It is an entire system. And like I alluded to, we did run into some issues with the printing. At Kenyatta specifically, the responsibility for who was supposed to order toner and the availability of replacement parts got sort of lost in translation, and that didn't end up happening quite the way we had hoped. But overall, I would say that the system is not actually that large for the PartoPen project. The chargers are a wall charger. They plug in with a micro USB cable, just like your cell phone. And those, I mean, that part of the system functioned very well. The printing, there were issues. But there's really two components to the system, the pens and the printing of the paper. And so if you can somehow find a really good quality way to implement that system as a whole, I think that you're probably in pretty good shape for doing digital pen deployments. But the key is to find sustainable, local, like low-cost printers, paper, toner, and replacement supplies. And then you're good, which now Kenyatta does have, so yeah.
Any other questions from non-committee members? Well, then,
Sorry. This is slightly
Shy Joe.
I will retract my question. However, I'm going to ask it anyway. You identified that you did follow-up interviews with 7 nurses. Is there some reason why it wasn't more?
Yeah, so the computer survey, it had 5 partographs that they were analyzing, and then however many bubbles there was a lot of bubbles on the survey. And so the survey itself, if they did all 5 partographs, took about 40 minutes. And you can't get a nurse to sit and do an entire survey for 40 minutes when they're already understaffed and patients are coming in and there's chaos all the time, there's phone ringings, there's no office space to actually set up a computer survey for someone to do. So I'm actually thrilled I got seven surveys.
So how many nurses do you think actually used the PartoPen across?
All 50 nurses used the PartoPen at some point in time. Yeah. If they were on a shift anytime in August, then they used the PartoPen. Yeah.
You may have mentioned this in your presentation, and this slipped past me, but you had mentioned the difference between PartoPens being in the hands of nurses versus trainees. Was that your decision, or was that the hospital's decision?
So it was my decision, but it was based on some strong encouragement from the nurses themselves. They didn't actually feel comfortable having the students use the pens for fear that the pens would walk off. So that design decision was made early in the study, and yeah, it didn't actually prove to be that much of a problem. We still got quite a few partographs filled out by the nurses. The other reason for that decision was that we had already done the student study, and we didn't want, because some of the students were the same students, so by the time they got to their clinical rotation, they were in the maternity ward while we were doing that study. So if we were to give everyone pens, there would be some bias there. They already would have known how to use it and were familiar with the functionality, so we limited it to nurses.
Is that a decision you still stand by for designing now?
It is. It is. Although I think that if I were going to do it again, I would bring more pens, so I wouldn't be so worried about them walking off and not having enough, and then give it to everyone who's filling out partographs in labor ward. And that actually proved to be more of a problem when we were doing the Pumwani study, because there was 2 nurses, and they deliver almost twice as many babies per day as Kenyatta, and then there was about 3 times as many students. And so there were no partographs collected from Pumwani, because the nurses were just organizing students, so.
Okay then, thank you all.
Thank you.